All right. Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. How's it going? How you doing, Andy? I've got us kind
Happy
of in a
Friday.
weird layout. There we
Happy
go.
Friday. Yep. All right. Welcome. We'll go ahead and kick this thing off. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to 365 Deep Dive with John and Andy. He's John. I'm Andy. And today we have a very special guest joining us here on the show. Some say he works in a garage, but they only have Azure toolkits, and that the garage is powered by the Power Platform. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, Mr. Jeremy Chapman.
Hey everybody,
Awesome. Hey,
thanks.
Jeremy.
Good to see you. Hopefully everything's working. My microphone, it kind of disconnected and reconnected right before we went live, so just wanted to check that first. But wow, it's
Yeah,
hard
you
to
You
sound
are
good, man.
there.
it's hard to live up to the intro of The Stig, one of my favorite television shows of all times. But thank you for that, and I'm happy to be
Oh,
here
thank
today.
you.
This is a great honor to speak with the MVP community and really go a bit deeper on a lot of the things that we've talked about with Microsoft 365 Copilot, but hopefully putting it together and packing it up in 2 full hours of lots of details and technical details that maybe you might have missed along the way in the last few months.
Yeah, we're really
I'm
excited
really
to have you,
excited.
man.
Yeah. I've been excited about this since we talked about it back at MVP Summit back in the spring. I think that was right around the time of the Copilot announcement
Hmm.
hmm
as well. So like been gearing up for this one. So we know who you are, but for some of those users that are tuning in for the first time, do you want to give a brief introduction, tell everybody what you do and some of your role at Microsoft?
Yeah, so I started out working in IT. I think like probably a lot of people on the stream are in the current capacity, and I was doing Windows deployments. I worked in Germany and in China. I did managed SQL databases, data backends, front ends, all of those things, and all the infra and the metal around delivering the services, the backups, and all everything that we had to do as part of just delivering IT services.
Yeah.
And basically, after I moved back, and it was the reason why I came to Microsoft is that our son was born, and we were living in Shanghai at the time, and it was easier, I think, in terms of raising our son here in the U.S. And so we came back, and at
hmm
that point, I joined Microsoft. And my first job, and it was probably one of my favorite jobs ever, was working on the business desktop deployment solution accelerator to get Windows deployed at scale. And then so that was kind of my first soiree into working at Microsoft and building out solution accelerators. And there were a bunch of security and deployment. And if you remember the architecture series that we did for IPD and WSSRA and those kind of things. And then I went to Windows like proper to start doing imaging, deployment, app compat, all of those things. And then
hmm
from there went into Office, because then at that point we were like, how do we get people to start using application virtualization as a way to deliver Office clients and the endpoints out to different Windows machines? So that's when we built out the whole click to run set of solutions. And then at that point there was a lot of, that's kind of when the whole mechanics thing started. So I was doing a lot of evangelism, going to all the different events. I'd usually speak between half a dozen and 10 different times if it was a tech ed or a different SharePoint conference, those kind of things. And then we decided we've got to scale this out. We've got to go and try to make people aware of how the cloud works. And for example, on Click to Run and Office Pro Plus at the time, that it all runs locally on the hard drive. You don't need to be connected to the internet at all times to use it and those kind of things. And then that just kept building. So then we built out to the rest of Office 365. And then the Surface team wanted to take part. And then, like all of the in Azure. And then, eventually Windows came in as part of another contributor to what we did in mechanics. We changed the name. We were originally the Garage, as kind of you said in your Stig intro. And
hmm
then our name got taken from us when the Microsoft Labs changed its name to the Microsoft Garage. So
Oh,
at that point, we became Microsoft Mechanics, and we're all about like just reverse engineering, showing how things work, everything that we do, and it's one of the best jobs, probably the best job I've ever had, where I just get to continually shift from topic to topic, go in deep, and you kind of reverse engineer the way things work with the engineering PMs and architects for any solution that's being built, so that we're the double click in terms of giving additional introduction to any of the announcements that we make, or some of the major initiatives, things like Zero Trust or deploying Windows, or Copilot right now. And
Mhm.
this is part of what I just love doing, because you get to go in really deep and kind of immerse yourself in a different area, and then change that up every few months as different things are getting the spotlight. So we've been doing mechanics since, I think it was renamed mechanics maybe in 2014 or so, but we've been doing it
Yeah.
almost 10 years in terms of that side of things. And it's never dull, because everything continually shifts and the ground's always moving in terms of where to focus and where to have your attention put on things.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we were putting this together over the last few weeks, a lot of what you were saying, like the behind the scenes of how you come up with the topics in the show, it reminded me a lot of Top Gear, and that's why the Stig got stuck
Mm-hmm.
in the back of my head, because you're deep diving into this information, but you've got to distill it down into something you can deliver in like a 10 or 15 minute, like, short video to emphasize, the larger message that you're going through. But you're shifting back and forth from product to product,
Yeah.
and app and service, like you're like a walking encyclopedia when you start diving into this. So I imagine that it is a lot of fun, but also really challenging behind the scenes
It is,
to
and
keep
some
on top of
topics are
everything.
Oh
more
yeah.
involved than others. Like, I remember just immersing myself in quantum compute before we did the major announcements
Mhm.
back in 2018. And I spent weeks like reading everything I possibly could, watching everything, because at some point, my main thing in terms of presenting, I don't want to be on stage, presenting something as the authority and not know enough about it to where, like, the people that are watching me don't learn something or get something extra from what they
Yeah.
already know. So if I'm in a room full of like Windows deployment experts, I better have something extra to add in terms of value. So I'll spend the time, the weeks, the months to get as deep as possible. I probably installed 100,000 copies of Windows while I was doing Windows deployment in that side of product management, because I wanted
Yeah.
to know, like, where can things break, what will happen if different things go wrong, you lose connectivity, those types of things. So that's just my way, my method, in terms of I'm like a method actor in that sense, but I'm actually immersing myself into those different
Yeah.
areas. And then I would say, like, if you don't stay in that area, you do atrophy a little bit. So then it's always nice to go back and revisit a topic and then get deep again into that topic again, because after 6 months or 12 months, for example, if you haven't covered something or looked at something deeply, you need to get right back
Mhm.
into it. And it's a fun way to stay, like, to keep the brain neurons, I guess, firing, to stay deep on various topics. But yeah, it is a bit of work in terms of making sure that we can learn how things work, and the way to kind of describe them, and hopefully distill it down to where it's not too complicated as we explain stuff
Mhm.
on mechanics.
And I think that's a big reason why mechanics has been so successful over the years is the IT admins. I mean, many of them are watching right now. They can see right through if this is just marketing and it's just somebody reading on a teleprompter. They don't even know what they're
Mhm.
saying. And mechanics, it's got that real feel of like these are legit experts. They know what they're talking about. You come away with much more information than what you went into it. You guys aren't afraid to go deep and get in the weeds because the audience can handle it. And I think
Yeah.
that's been really working well for you guys. So
Right, right. No, I like to
it's
joke that,
awesome.
if I wasn't really interested in the different, they wouldn't have, like, with a face like this, they wouldn't have hired me to be the spokesperson if I was just a random, like, thespian. Like, I'm totally into whatever I'm presenting, and I'll go as deep as I
Hmm.
can on any topic. And it's true for the whole team. Like, there's a bunch of people behind mechanics, and we're all, like, trying to really, really find the hook, find the story, find how the technology works, and present that in a way that isn't too
Yeah.
long, or too, that's consumable and in the right length, and those kind of things. Or if you invest that 10, 12 minutes, you'll come out with
Yeah.
enough knowledge to be dangerous on that topic, and hopefully you'll want to learn more about it and go deeper and try it. Like, that's the whole point.
Yeah. Cool. So
Well, I think that's a good
along that theme, yeah.
segue into what I think most people
Yep.
are really interested in hearing today, and that's
Yeah.
Copilot, Microsoft 365 Copilot.
Hmm.
I think it's safe to say that 2023 is the year of AI. It's everywhere, and it seems like there are new services coming out every single day that are introducing AI in different ways. And some people, way smarter than myself, have said this is probably one of the biggest things that technology-wise has hit since the internet.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
this is a pretty seismic shift, not only in how we work, but maybe even in our day-to-day lives. So For those that are joining us for the first time, welcome to the show. Go back, check out some of the recordings in the libraries. We do a deep dive. So we're going to be here for the next 2 hours and dive deep into this particular topic. And for our friends that are returning, welcome back. Thanks for helping spread the word and being with us. But we do have a lot to cover. So over the next 2 hours, we do want to do a really deep dive into Microsoft 365 Copilot. So if you're joining us on LinkedIn, if you're joining us on YouTube, feel free to send questions, comments, thoughts in the chat window. We're watching those and we'll work those into the conversation as we're kind of moving along. But with that, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic, an implementer's guide to Microsoft 365 Copilot. So first, why don't we start off at a high level? How will Microsoft 365 Copilot enhance our productivity and day-to-day work and our everyday task?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts there. I've been using this for a few months now, and just getting started, getting out of the blank page. We even in mechanics, we're building out shows about topics that might have existed for a while, to where it's either known to a large language model like GPT, or it's something that through retrieval we can find out more information on it. I was just thinking the other day about the show that we built with Mark Rasinovich on the infrastructure, and there were a lot of technical terms, a lot of product names have been around, NVLink and NVSwitch, and various protocols, InfiniBand, etc., where you don't just like go down this rabbit hole of trying to search for stuff, but it will generate you content and something that's quite good, usable. It's a draft. There will, as we always have in any of the demos or things that we do, there will be some mistakes. It is AI generated content. But just the time savings that you get versus going down like a rabbit hole of trying to find information about a certain topic, it's been game changing for me just using that in the last couple of months to get really past that kind of blank page syndrome. And then the other thing I love about it, and these are just probably two examples out of many, but when you're in a meeting, and I'm in back-to-back meetings, typically this is kind of a lot of vacations overlapping and different schedules going on. But usually, or often I should say, we're doing a dry run or a rehearsal on a show that we're building or something, and we're 20 minutes, 30 minutes late to our next meeting. And that's been running. So like going into Teams and being able to say, like, can you summarize, what's been talked about right now? What's the mood? What's the sentiment? What's the vibe in the meeting right now? Those kind of things, again, like you could try to manually do that if, transcript was turned on and you tried to read the transcript kind of parallel processing while the rest of the meeting is going on. But this will just in seconds like give you a summary of what's happened. And I love that the speed at which it can do that kind of work. And you can then ask it a secondary or a third question, in terms of getting even more detail. Hey, somebody talked about me in the second bullet point that it summarized the meeting with. Can you elaborate on that? And what's the expectation that I do to deliver on that item? Like those are the kind of things that are just like, for me, massive time savers and things that, just that you could do before, but it just took, it took a lot more effort. And it was, like anything that we're doing with generative AI to write a proposal or something based on a existing doc. Yes, you could manually write it and go to the other doc and take its format and all of those things. But all of that stuff, it takes a lot of time. So if you get something that will get you 95 or 90% of the way there, that's awesome. And that's kind of the way I've been using it, and just ways to just write even prose text about various like technical capabilities. Like it's just been a game changer for me in the last couple of months since I've been using it.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about Copilot, and I think what I'd like to delve into next about like Bing Chat Enterprise that was just announced, is the fact that, like you said, it makes your life easier. And I think a big part of that is having it available and there in the interface, right? So, whenever it comes to other things, like I've used ChatGPT in the past or Siri on my phone, it's like I forget that it's there because you kind of have to go out of your way to get to it. But things like having the Bing bar up in the corner of Edge, having that available, it's more, it's just a click away at that point. So, I think it's interesting whenever they announced it at Inspire, Bing Chat Enterprise, that like, if nothing else, if we can just wrap that existing functionality in the browser we're already using and secure that, it's so available that hopefully we kind of lead people into that safer, more secure LLM to use in their
Yeah,
daily work because it's there. And I'm really excited to see as it implements, as Copilot implements into the different applications, like how is it going to surface so that it's there to be helpful, and it's like a fine line of being in the way versus being too out of the way and you forget that it exists, finding that
right.
middle ground. So,
And it takes that extra step because and you can do this,
mhm,
and we showed it through Bing Chat Enterprise, where you could take, say, a copy and pasted piece of text and give me an analysis of what I've just pasted into the prompt through Bing Chat Enterprise, and that we're guaranteeing the fact that we're saying that from a data protection and privacy perspective, like all of those different needs are met, and we'll go a bit more deeper
mhm,
into that topic in a bit, but doing that in say an open kind of solution where you're actually taking business content and pasting it in and saying, give me a summary, like you don't know where that's going, and there aren't necessarily going to be these kind of tenants around how that service is run and managed. So it makes it not only like for the office apps where it's actually part of the workflow and kind of contained in that app experience for the user, but even when you're using Bing Chat Enterprise, like there are enough kind of descriptions around how we're using that data, things that we're not doing, things that in
mhm,
terms of the data security and privacy that we're performing as part of using that data, and in terms of including it in prompts, etc. That you're not necessarily getting those kind of assurances, I guess, from other solutions that are out there where you might do something like that. And then the apps take it to
mhm,
another level, because now when you're using Microsoft 365 Copilot, it's able to get and put commands against the graph, so you can basically have not only retrieval of information that is pertinent to your role or to the thing that you're trying to create, but even use put commands to plop it right into the document so that it's formatted and
mhm.
it has all the right look and feel and everything to it, to where it looks like it belongs in that document, that PowerPoint or that Excel file. So it's a lot more convenient. It's another layer of
Yeah.
time savings versus like, I'm going to grab a paragraph out of a TXT or a docx file and then put it into this other service and see what it says and then paste it back. Now, if it's fully integrated
Mhm.
with the apps, it's going to save you that much more time, especially, and it's going to do all the formatting and the additional things around it.
Yeah. So you prepared a couple of animations, right, to kind of like show what this looks like to those who are watching who haven't seen things like Bing Chat Enterprise. Do you have those keyed up that you can kind of
Yeah,
talk
so
through a
this
little bit of
just
what it looks like?
from a Copilot perspective, and I've got it on the screen here, like what is
Mhm.
Copilot? It's really the culmination, using natural language to be able to interact with large language models, leveraging data that's in the Microsoft Graph, and that's data that's part of Microsoft 365, or things
Mhm.
that are wired into Microsoft Graph, and then the endpoints. So being able to use the Microsoft 365 apps, like we mentioned. And so, in terms of the experiences, amazing things are happening in terms of putting them into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and kind of the Monarch app, the new version of Outlook, and
Mhm.
Microsoft Teams in a few different ways. One through, like we mentioned, with the meetings where you can kind of in real time do summaries, those types of things, and also through the cross app experience as well, where you can chat using information from the graph and the large language model, and ask questions like, what was the meeting like yesterday with this person that I missed, or when was the last time I worked with John, and what do we
Mhm.
talk about, like those kind of things, where you're actually able to do the retrieval against graph data, and then present that back with citations of the work. So you've got these nice endpoint kind of inclusions that we're going to add across the different main core Office app experiences. And I know Daryl Webster's on, so Loop is one of them too. I don't have it on the screen,
Mhm.
but Loop also has a great experience, and even like we showed how you can have multiple people like iterate against the prompt, which is really cool. And so what it does is it basically gives you access to the content that you use for business with all the privacy security controls. We'll talk about that and how that works. It's all user context based, and the context of your work, and the different other parts. The graph is really good in terms of knowing like who is your manager and what are the different activities that you've done, and seeing like how things are trending. Like a lot of the different graph API calls that you can make now can be manifested through through your prompts effectively, through cross app intelligence, and through that chat experience that we have in Microsoft Teams. So there's a lot that you'll be able to do. And just to show what that looks like, so this is the actual what the current experience looks like. I know probably a lot of people have seen what the March 16th experience looks like, but if you were watching the Partner Inspire conference, this is what the current kind of iteration looks like. And it's interesting when you demo this, because you've got to do it, or we do this from our Microsoft.com account. So this is something that is, because obviously you'd have like all of your conversations and those things typically in Frame, but just to show you what it looks like. So in Teams, you basically have the ability to prompt the Copilot and the large language model with questions that are going to be able to call the graph. So prepare a 250-word sales pitch for Rolla Cloud Thunderbolt e-bike that's based on these different files and documents. So you can choose the ones that you want to use. So here I'm going to choose this Word doc. And then
while you're typing, it's doing those graph calls to say, here's relevant people and relevant files that you might be helpful in building even the prompt before you sent it.
And you can see it. So
That's cool.
It's already created that, and it's got the reference cited there that you can go to and make sure that it's the most relevant document. And I love this one, create a SWOT analysis. So it knows what the heck is a SWOT analysis and how to actually word things in a way that strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and can give you great data on, in this case, this Thunderbolt e-bike that you're building. And it gives you all of the references, and you'll see this is new, the web reference as well, in terms of public information in this case, that it can pull from. So, and then you can check the references as well, which you should, like, just to make sure all of the things that are being referenced are factual. So then you can ask it even deeper questions, because it has that language inferencing ability. And so like here, that gives you specific recommendations, in this case, to upgrade your Thunderbolt e-bike to a premium version, what it would look like, and in terms of catching up to maybe other market competitors and what the market looks like in this case for e-bikes. But it's a very intelligent experience in terms of what you're able to do, because it has that language inferencing and the natural language input model that you can use with it. So you don't have to be very, like in the past, you would have had to be pretty formulaic in terms of how you would ask these types of questions or query your data or those types of things. Whereas because it has the natural language ability, you can ask things in your terms effectively, and it can decipher what you're trying to get from it, and then infer what you want back, and then give you these types of results.
I want to draw attention to the ability to follow up from like the original prompt query search, the ability to follow up and expand, or even in some cases pivot or cross-reference with something else. I think that's been the biggest benefit of working with some of these technologies since they've become publicly available. Like even just in like Bing Chat, for instance, I start off on a specific topic. The example that I use often is Excel, a VLOOKUP versus an XLOOKUP. So I can ask it what a VLOOKUP is, ask it what an XLOOKUP is, and then ask for examples of both and pros and cons of when I might want to use one versus like another. And that's getting kind of, deep into like, Excel land, but it's the ability to ask that follow-up question and to pivot or cross-reference something that it really extends the capabilities of this. I would have to do all that work manually, parse through it all manually, and this can kind of infer and then start doing some of that automatically. And that's really, for me, the game changer.
And that was, if we roll and we're going to go through kind of the history in a minute, but like that was kind of where it started, like the GPT-3 integration that we had with Power Apps and Power Platform, where basically you would say, I want to do this, and then it would create the power effects for you as a means of doing that, so that it would know, like, you don't even need to ask if it's going to be a VLOOKUP or other types of info lookups. You would just be able to say, I just want this and this and this, and it would say, here's the power effects that I propose that you try out, and you'd try it out and you'd be like, that's exactly what I want.
That's
and then
awesome.
that kind of morphed into and led to GitHub Copilot and being able to generate more code. So that's one of the actual sweet spots in terms of LLM and natural language and generative AI in general, is generating these kind of code samples and recommendations for how to automate something, or really up your game in terms of whether you're using Excel or Power Apps.
Yeah, I have to admit, like whenever I saw the Copilot announcement in March, I was one of those that was like, oh, here's Microsoft trying to ride the trend and promise too much too early and all that. I'm not in the Power Platform community quite as much, and I'm certainly not in the GitHub developer to realize how long Microsoft had already been putting generative AI into things. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I knew that like learning models were there and being able to like take a picture of your receipts in OneDrive and being able to search it. Like, yeah,
Mhm.
AI kind of in the background, but I didn't realize like how much history was already there with things like GitHub and Power Apps and
Yeah.
things like that. So
Yeah, no, it's not new.
it's
I'll
there's
go
more
through
legs than I thought.
some of the history and where we started. We're not. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say that we're like at V1 from that capability in terms of using GPT based large language models. Like there's been a lot of work that's happened over the years for that, and I'll go through some of that in a bit. The thing that's pretty exciting though
Yeah.
from this week though, just to go back to some of the things that were announced, and you mentioned it earlier with the Bing Chat Enterprise.
Yeah.
So this is basically giving you the ability to do, if you want to use business data, the retrieval, like I mentioned, would be manual in that case. You're copying and pasting like information that might be in a file that you have that might be, say, stored in SharePoint or OneDrive, for example. But it gives you that ability to do that and do that with basically safety in mind and the right privacy controls in place. So right when you open it, you can see that it says it's protected. Anything that you put in there is going to be protected in terms of how Microsoft uses it and how the Bing Chat Enterprise experience is leveraging any information that's provided in the prompt. And we'll get to that in a second in terms of explaining that a bit more deeply. But Bing Chat Enterprise, in the same kind of way like we showed before, if you bring with it some information, you can see we're protected, it's designed for work. So when you
Yeah.
actually paste in something like we're doing here, then it can actually create and generate AI in terms of, in this case, a sales pitch for our same Thunderbolt e-bike. So in the same way that we just saw from the team's perspective, the difference here is that you're actually going out and you have in mind the text that you want to give to it as part of the retrieval. And we'll talk about retrieval augmented generation in a bit. We'll build up to these things, but this gives you those same types of abilities, a nice formatting like you can see here in terms of being able to easily generate content that's very easy to follow and kind of visually see the different, in this case, the different specs for a bike. So it is very powerful. And the nice thing with this is just part of if you've got Microsoft Enterprise or Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, this is part of that. It's using Entra ID as the authentication and authorization mechanism in terms of logging in, and it's like mentioned, it's a protected environment in terms of how it works from as you provide information to the prompt perspective, what's happening to that information. It's all secured, over encrypted connection to and from the Bing Chat Enterprise service, so you can feel good about using it, basically.
Yeah, and as we kind of wrap up here at the end, I'm taking notes off on the side. If everybody sees me like looking over, we use a Loop workspace to take notes. And what I
Mhm.
kind of want to end with here is like, what's the implementer's checklist, right? Of like, what should you be thinking about? What should you be implementing? And I think Bing Chat Enterprise is going to be one of those things that definitely goes on the list to kind of prepare for the world of Copilot. In my mind, if you're already E3, E5, I don't know why you wouldn't do Bing Chat Enterprise and at least wrap that data in that security. Like I don't know why you wouldn't want to swing that agreement of using Bing from the consumer over to your MSA for your organization if they're logged in with Azure AD or Intra ID now. It's going to take me a long time to stop saying AAD.
Yeah.
Enabling that type of feature so that at least like the chat history is not saved, you're not sending data to be learned by an LLM.
Mhm.
I think that's definitely something we'll want to put on our checklist for recommendations for our admins that are watching.
Exactly, and you kind of mentioned in terms of how we got here, and this isn't like our first soiree or the newest thing that we've
Yeah.
done in terms of the using large language models. So I
Hmm.
wanted to go through like a little bit of how we got here, and kind of recap of
Okay.
all the different major milestones when you think about it. So from a large language model and just AI perspective, Microsoft's been doing this for a decade. Like, it's been a long, long time that we've been working with massive compute infrastructure. We were really early in terms of our adoption of things like networking GPUs via InfiniBand. And you can look this up in terms of the different N series VMs, things you can get in Azure. And so, from that perspective, if you look at even these are more recent in terms of our Megatron
Hmm.
Turing natural language generative model, which I love the name of, and it's because transformer is the T, by the way,
Yeah.
if you think of GPT.
It's a
So there's a
transformer
method
model. All right.
to that madness of naming with Megatron. But in terms of just the size and the growth of models, if you look at from 2018, starting with Elmo, going all the way through to the Megatron Turing with 530 billion parameters, like these have grown exponentially like over the years. And we've been building out compute infrastructure, and this is massive. And we did this show with Mark Russinovich recently on the supercomputer that runs this, and kind of some of the specs that I'll get to on like even running GPT-3.
Yeah.
But GPT-3, 175 billion parameters. These things are not trivial in terms of their size and kind of the compute it takes to run training and inference against them. So if we look at just relatively like GPT versus Megatron, it grew 3 or 4x, and then it's even growing more. Now as we're getting into even more sophisticated models that, as part of training, are ingesting publicly known information and things. Part of the training set, websites, documents, things that are public. We never train on your private data or anything that's stored in Microsoft
Hmm.
365 or Azure, and that's always part of the promise. And just as I was working with Mark Russinovich to build out the supercomputer, so like they are two completely separate operations from from an AI training and inference perspective. Like the hardware, the metal that's used to run training versus in the frequency of the training versus the how inferencing runs 24/7. It's being used on completely different different spec systems. There are different spec hardware and used at different times, and a training job could run for 45 or 60 or 90
Hmm.
days. Like it's a whole different thing. And so we'll talk about that as well. Like, we've built a bunch of things with Project Forge and how you can basically use checkpoints as part of that process, so that even if you had a power outage, say in a data center, while a training of a large language model was running on day 44 out of 45, you don't lose
Hmm.
44 days of progress. We've built for those types of things also as part of the platform to run AI. And really, when you think about the 2016, that's how far back it goes from a OpenAI perspective. Like, that's when OpenAI came to Microsoft in terms of us running their AI infrastructure. So then, that led to 2019, which is already like 4 years ago, almost to the day. In terms of then
Doesn't seem like that long ago.
yeah, and then that's kind of when from a Microsoft investment and that perspective, going all in on these sets of technologies. And then quickly thereafter we started building that into products. Like I said, with Power Platform, you had Power Apps, things like Power Apps Ideas that I mentioned before, where we could do things like author Power Effects using GPT-3, and have more capabilities that were maybe less accessible, because somebody would need to know, like, how does Power Effects work, and I want to do these various things with my app. But if it's beyond their reach and you need like a little bit more kind of pro code, we always say low code, pro code. If you need like
Hmm.
professional developer type expertise, this made that a lot more approachable and a lot easier to get those more advanced capabilities running through Power Apps and Power Platform. And then, like I mentioned, GitHub then was kind of the next iteration in 2021, where with Copilot there, and I've used this to write. I haven't written a console app in a few years, and I literally
Hmm.
wrote a console app to call, GPT models with GitHub Copilot, and it fully worked. It gave me all the instructions to compile it, run it. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
crazy how good this stuff is. You have to check the code, obviously, but just in terms of generating code, getting you started quickly, getting something that works, that, at least, from that perspective, getting an operational features and capabilities in, it's pretty amazing. The time savings that it gives you from a coding perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that got better. We think about natural language to flow and some of the Power Automate work that was done that we announced last fall. Being able to say, hey, when something arrives in this Excel file, then send an email that thanks them for appending their data field, like those types of natural language commands, and doing that versus, it was already easy to do Power Automate and create flows to some extent, but now that you can just naturally describe what you want, and it will infer what you're trying to do and build most of that out for you. Again, these kind of automations and things are just getting way more within reach, and way more accessible for anybody to be able to use automation and generate
Mm-hmm.
some pretty amazing solutions. So all of this is just making life easier across multiple different vectors.
Yeah, I think Daryl has a good point on here that I think would be good to kind of maybe take a step back and containerize what we just talked about here. Daryl was saying, hey, training compute is why this is additional. It's not cheap to do this type of stuff. What comes to my mind is, so what Jeremy was talking about whenever he's talking 175 billion objects, 560 or whatever it was, and those exponential
30,
numbers,
yeah.
that is training that has already happened, right? So when you're thinking in terms of Bing Chat or Copilot, things like that, that's one piece of the data that's being used to build the response, right? That's why like ChatGPT goes up to, what is it, September of 2021. That's those items. But what Copilot does and what Bing does, whenever we saw Bing come out in January, it was, you've got those objects, it's aware of those things, but it's also connected to the internet and everything that has been created since that time that transformer model was trained on, that finite set of data. You've also got the internet searches, which is why you see Bing execute internet searches to learn, like, oh, what is the current Super Bowl teams and stuff like that. And then
Yeah.
you bring Copilot in, there's that live graph connection where I think I want to make it clear that Copilot is not training on the data that is in the graph. Not at all. It's one of the components. It's one of the sources that it's used when it does that thing called grounding, where it checks the trained data, it checks the internet, it checks the people, the files, everything that's a live connection in the Microsoft Graph, in order to come back with a well-crafted response to that prompt.
Yeah.
So it's not that we're paying $30 a month to subsidize training of the internet on LLMs. It's the trained model is just part of all of those different bubbles of what you get access to, above and beyond if you were just using like ChatGPT or something.
Yeah. So, and I was gonna go there anyway, but I think you fast forwarded me a little bit in terms of time.
Oh yeah, to jump ahead of your picture.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
no problem. And I want to say, I'll just pause this here actually. But the nice thing with, when you think about the different, this is all about retrieval augmented generation and retrieving information.
Mhm.
Grounding is part of that process that has pre-processing. So there's something called a system or a default prompt that kind of has rules for how things run and work. That gets
Yeah.
processed in, plus what the user asked for, plus what information can be retrieved through the graph. And like you said, in some cases, like when you're using Bing Chat Enterprise or Bing Chat even on the consumer side, it's moving information in from the open internet in terms of trying to find the most relevant content, work that in, apply the citations, all of those kind of things before the prompt is even presented to the large language model. Hold on. Let me play this back. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here. Okay, so before the prompt is generated or is presented to the large language model, so it's doing all of those different steps to work with the different data sources that it has access to, all based on the user permissions in the context of the person using Copilot. And another thing that we're doing is we're using what's called the semantic index, which has like relationships and other things in terms of your organization, so it can more quickly give you results. then searching over things like OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, parsing that information, then bringing that back into Copilot so it can present all of that as part of the prompt and say, like, based on the information that you have access to, here is that paragraph you wanted me to generate. One way to think about retrieval augmented generation is, like, if I asked you right now, and we haven't talked about this before the call, but like if I said, what's my shoe size to you, there's no way that you'd ever be able to know this. But if I said, hi, my name's Jeremy, my shoe size is 12, I'm 6'4", what's my shoe size? Of course you can tell that, because basically what's happening is, like that example, we're going out, we're retrieving that extra information of shoe size and height or whatever, then presenting that as the first prompt versus just the question of what's my shoe size. So then it can answer because it's got additional information that's been appended to your question. And that's kind of what's happening in terms of that retrieval. And you don't see it because it's happening like instantaneously under the covers. And then when that question goes out, the LLM has the information it needs to generate the response for you because you appended that extra information in there. And we'll go through what that looks like in code, because I think the best way to look at this is actually through code using the Jupyter Notebook, like we showed with Pablo Castro, our distinguished engineer for AI and search. But these are the things that are actually happening kind of behind the scenes, where it's not just your question that goes to the LLM. It's your question plus, okay, if I want to answer that question, what must I retrieve in order to provide additional information for this LLM that doesn't know Jeremy's shoe size to be able to answer that question that was posed to me? And that's the way that extra retrieval works. So those are the things that you kind of don't see that make the magic work behind the scenes. And that's that's really what the graph and the internet and the different information sources that it can cite are giving to your prompt in order to give you that answer back.
So is Daryl correct here in that, hey, he says, oh, well, I thought it was learning about our organization. According to what we've talked about here, the LLM, the data that the graph has access to, those are separate and remain separate, right? It's just the prompt is constructing a better prompt with that additional context and then adding that context back when it comes to the end user. But it's not, the peanut butter's not getting into the chocolate, right? It's not getting mixed together and learned on it. Yeah.
There's no recall. You can try this out with Bing Chat Consumer if you're not using Enterprise right now. Like if you use the sweep command, which is the new conversation button.
Oh yeah, the little
you can ask it a question
icon
today, and it will respond with that, and you can keep drilling in and getting more and more responses, and then you can sweep the history of that conversation and ask it the same question that you just asked it 30 seconds ago, and it won't know. And the reason is because there's no storage of what you've been prompting. It's not learning in real time. The kind of fallacy there is like you're assuming that it's kind of like a human, I guess, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to assume like this is like somebody that's retaining information as you ask it questions, because it doesn't work that way. Every time you're prompting it new and it's getting new information, and once you remove the conversation history, because every time you ask it, it's building the previous question that you asked it plus its previous response plus and then once you wipe that away, it's completely lost all context of what you were just asking it. So there's nothing that's stored or retained by that LLM.
And that terminology
met you before when you sweep the conversation.
Yeah. That terminology is called turns, right? Where you were showing the demonstration of like Bing Enterprise, and it's 1 of 30, 2 of 30, 3 of 30. Those are turns in the current conversation, but whenever you sweep that, your turning starts over, right?
Right. The whole conversation is, so the way to think about turns, and this is in prompts, by the way. So when we think about the different prompting styles, a lot of people maybe have started with things like smart speakers, where you're asking it, what's the temperature outside, and that's what's called kind of a zero-shot prompt, where you're just asking, a basic question. Give me a more descriptive word for happy, and then it will say joyful. And these are all real things that we've tested. Restate, winter is coming. A good one for winter is coming soon. The days are getting shorter. Like it'll be able to give you that kind of response. That's called zero shot, because you're not telling it or giving it any expectation as to what type of reply you want.
Whereas you're just throwing something at it.
If you then give it some Q&As like we're showing here, which is called Few Shot, then you can say, like, based on the question I'm going to ask you, I want a one-word response back, because we said, like, here are 2 different questions and the answer was yes or no. It can infer that the next time you throw a question up, it's going to need to respond to you with 1 word, and that's what Few Shot prompting is about. So that's kind of the groundwork in terms of what prompting means. Now, in terms of how things work, and this is another, if you haven't caught this, we're going to give links at the end as well in terms of our playlist to check out, but this is the show that we did with Pablo Castro using Azure OpenAI service. And this sample app is something you can get from GitHub, by the way, and deploy into Azure. And it's pretty easy to get everything up and running with the same code, the same backend data, the whole thing, using cognitive search and Azure OpenAI. So the nice thing with this one is it's basically connecting employees in this case in terms of their health plans and how that works. And like I said, the app has everything included in it. And if you go into the different ways that you can leverage the app, it's showing, like, what is this IM Start? What is it searching for? The IM Start system is the kind of the rules that need to be abided by when the LLM responds to you. So be helpful, be polite, do these things correctly, cite your information and your sources. And then when it goes out and actually retrieves a source, it can basically go in. It's finding, in this case, a PDF file that you can see in the middle of the right pane there, mounting that PDF, extracting the text from it in the second PDF, using that then to effectively respond to and infer the response to your question. And just to go a little bit deeper, because I always say there's truth in code. If you go into the Jupyter Notebook, and I love Jupyter Notebooks because you can not only, like, see the code that's there, but you can actually interact with it and see the responses to it. Yeah. So, like, in a Jupyter Notebook, first you can see, in our case with our OpenAI service, we're using Azure and authenticating with we're using an Entra ID. I'm also getting used to the new naming. And Azure Active Directory is the means to get into this. But when you actually run in an interactive way against the code using the notebook, you can kind of see the way that the different pieces are constructed. So there's our Entra ID. Now, if we look at the different turns here, the IM Start and the user and the assistant turns. So if I do a prompt, the assistant responds, and we can see how it's responding. So if I go into history, that history is actually something that we can use to augment future prompts effectively. So now that I've got the future prompt and the response back to it, and I ask a question, how about hearing, which is somewhat related to my last question, it knows that I'm still referring to the Northwind Health Plus plan and those kind of things. It's got the context from my previous prompt. So then when we look at the content, you can see it's mounting our PDF there in this case. And when we look at the code for the prompt itself, this prompt grew like a snowball. It has the IM Start, which is the system prompt. It has the subsequent prompts and responses as part of it. And so, like, your third or fourth prompt, it's getting presented with all of that stuff, the entire snowball. So then, once you go back and you say you do completion, you decide to remove history, there is no recollection, recall whatsoever of what you've been prompting the LLM with. All of this information just goes away because, like I said, training's a whole other exercise that happens at a whole other point in time with an entirely different stack of infrastructure. So the way that all we're doing here is basically doing retrieval augmented prompting, the generating based on the retrieval of information. And every time you're doing a turn, like you mentioned, each turn is every time you ask a question and it responds, or you send a prompt and it responds back, that's a turn. And so every subsequent turn is stored into the turn history. When you leave, you're gone. Its memory of you is gone, and it waits for the next person to come up with another prompt. Yeah. And so that's the way everything is working there.
Man, so that's crazy to see how it expands. Because, like, I'm learning prompt engineering, and we're all kind of like trying to upskill into prompt engineering. But, I am absolutely not typing 150 words perfectly crafted, into these prompts to do that. Like, that assistance of adding all of that context to the beginning and the end of, like, this is really what John is talking about, is way more helpful than me having to kind of, like, massage it into what I actually want it to be. um, it's interesting to just kind of see how the machine builds that based off of the conversation that you're having with it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's
Huh.
and that's the and again, these are like the massive, massive time savers in terms of when you do search and you find that PowerPoint or that Word doc or that PDF file, and it does extract the right components. That might be a 100-page file, and it needs to get a subsection of the file and present that within the prompt
Yeah.
because that's the most pertinent section. And I always think about, like, imagine all the different times you've wanted to find an answer to something and you go down this rabbit hole of looking through a search engine, and then it takes multiple different attempts at reading
Hmm.
a bunch of stuff over and over and over again. You might learn a little bit as you go, but sometimes it's the third or fourth or fifth attempt to find that content that you want.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of things that the orchestration engine can help distill, like the most relevant content, and give you
Hmm.
back a response so that you save all of that time. Like I was talking about quantum computing, all of the different
Yeah.
searching. If I had this at the time, I would have probably shaved at least days, if not weeks, off of the time I spent to research quantum compute, because I had
Yeah.
to
And
look
it
up
just,
all of the terms of superposition and like all of
hmm
those different things as part of quantum. Like I can get that generated, and I've tried it. It does it in a very, very accurate way because that knowledge
yeah.
is out there.
And it's even harder and a lot of times in enterprises like this because it's like, okay, what silo is what I'm looking for in? And maybe that's not connected to Microsoft Search. So it's like, well, now is it in the HR system? Is it in my benefits? Is it in the
Yep.
the service portal? To just find like your hearing information.
And
Having
that's
that
the key, I
connection all
think.
around is so much more helpful.
Yeah, and that's what the extensibility layer and the plugins and being able to connect out to other systems and other information effectively will give you, is the
Hmm.
ability to, in a secure way. It's basically, if you've looked into how the ChatGPT plugins work, it's basically a JSON handshake with the security, the authentication kind of written into it to make sure that you have access to that external data source, then calling that external data source and having the retrieval basically able to retrieve information from that source in a secure way, present that to the prompt in the same kind of retrieval way that we were just showing before. And Teams message extensions, another way you can do it. If you've got Teams message extensions now, you've probably done a lot of the work to get the data already hooked into and wired into Teams. And then Power Platform connectors, and there's a lot of controls there. We just did a bunch of shows around Power Platform connectors and the things that you can do from a data loss prevention perspective and permissions, et cetera, around that. So there's a great story in terms of how you can connect to systems, and that there's everything ranging from like Power Platform connectors to SAP and Salesforce and other types of services that you can use. And there's a massive number that are available now that are already kind of pre-built. And so, like,
Hmm.
want to make sure that if your retrieval needs to go outside the boundaries of Microsoft 365, that there's a safe and secure way to go out, retrieve the information needed, and then be able to generate the responses that you're looking after. Again, with all the peace of mind to know that the right authentication and the right
Hmm.
authorization has happened to get to that data before it's presented to the prompt and generated as a response for you.
Yeah. And that's something I know, like, as you're talking about plugins and extensibility, what pops into my mind as an admin is hopefully Microsoft is thinking about, like, what's the admin experience of that going to look like, right? Yeah, you got all these chat GPT plugins. Will I, as an admin, be able to control which plugins it can have access to, right? If we use this ride sharing program as an enterprise and not that one, or this travel platform, can I get single sign on? And I think that'll be when we get to the next phase. It's hard to think about, like, what's the step after you just turn on Copilot, something that like isn't available outside of very few people.
Yeah.
Further down the road, it's like, okay, well, how is it? Am I going to be able to like do SAML authentication to these different services through those plugins? And I'm
Mhm.
starting to even think like a couple steps down the road of after we already have Copilot, how's it going to be even more useful? So.
Yeah, and this will make it more game changing in terms of the things that you'll, if you need to generate things and call the different systems. Like we kind of showed it
Hmm.
through the example from Pablo, which is basically saying cognitive search is wired into different repos to be able to grab information and present
Hmm.
that to the prompt effectively to the LLM and get the response back. the more that you can connect it to useful information, the better off it's going to be from a user experience perspective. Because if you think about like, you know, a lot of the manual processes where, oh, that information's stored in an HR system somewhere, or that information, I'm sorry, you can't find it through SharePoint search natively because it's in this other
Yeah.
thing. So imagine if you have the right security and the right, you know, the connections to that information where you can basically answer these types of questions very quickly, then it's just it's gonna help A, save people time, and B, build more familiarity and comfort with, you know, people using the service and getting value from it, frankly, in their everyday work. And I think the plugin, the extensibility story, getting that all, you know, additive to the Microsoft 365 Copilot is massive to make sure that, you know, there's this larger boundary of secure information access that you can use as part of generating content that's generated from the LLM in that case.
Daryl and I have such a soul connection. I was thinking the exact same thing here. Is like, I prefer to admin my copilots from one admin center. I'm curious, Daryl, in the chat, what do you think the inevitable admin center is going to be called, and how long before you think the name gets changed to something else and it gets merged into another admin center?
I
That'll
always
be a
think
future
these things are
episode of
kind of
mechanics.
like pendulums a little bit. Like there'll be a lot of times there's a massive consolidation push, and then you realize, no, people are actually fairly domain specific as SharePoint or whatever, and then the pendulum shifts out to separate things. So I you know, we'll have admin experiences as part of the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Like that's the plan, and that's what we've shown. And I'll show an excerpt of this in terms of the setup guide and licensing and those things that you do in Microsoft 365 Admin Center now. But yeah, it'll
it's all so big. I need a Copilot for my Copilot.
And those types of admin scenarios are really cool. Like we just did some work on, if you watch Build, there's, you know, the Microsoft Cost Management, which is kind of its own admin center. Frankly, it's basically how you manage your costs. Now there's an integration there using large language models and GPT to say, like, okay, if I changed my VM size from this to this N series VM, or I changed my networking endpoint from here to here, or I changed my storage type from, you know, premium to standard storage, like it's giving you the ability to do lookups and queries against your cost management data, and it's doing that in the context of kind of more admin controls. So I'm excited to see more of these admin things. I think like from just making my life easier, writing you know, things in terminal, in code through GitHub Copilot, etc. Like all of that's awesome, but then when you start to incorporate as part of admin GUIs, like that's going to be another next level thing.
Yeah. I know there was announcements. I didn't read anything about it, but I know there was announcements at Inspire of like a Copilot for security coming, you know, and being able to kind of augment
part
and
of the
lift up
MS Secure
the
event in
security
March.
stuff. Oh, okay. So it was back in March. Yeah. So, I mean, even like using Copilot to assist those internal operations, you know, all those sizzle demos are about like, oh, this person in sales trying to get customer, you know, details of their customers and stuff. But even internal operations will be able to benefit from these types of things. And you guys are building Copilots specific to those types of roles.
Yeah, and that was kind of one of the big stories, I think, this week from the Inspire conference was, not only do you have these general purpose copilots that are part of what you experience through Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, Teams, Loop, but you'll have these like role specific ones like the sales copilot, and like I mentioned before, the cost management one in Azure, you know, that we talked about at Build. Like these are more specific to your domain or your area that you work in. So you'll be able to get even more specialized value effectively from the large language models in those cases.
Yeah. Okay. So, Daryl has another good point in here about like, so back onto the topic of like preparing for Copilot in the organization and moving into, like, how do we remediate oversharing, or what do the admins, need to think about, like, you know, to get ready for this? Because it's not available now, but we also don't want to be caught flat-footed whenever Copilot is made available and the business starts demanding it. What do we do to prepare for it, right?
Yeah. And I think the thing that you can do right now, like whether you have access to the kind of the early access program or not in terms of Copilot, and something that's just the
Mhm.
best practice in general, unrelated to Copilot, is enabling just enough access and zero trust and all these things around information protections
Mm.
and the security around how your documents are found and discovered by people within your organization. So that's a big part of it. So in a lot of cases, you'll have maybe too much access, or what we call oversharing a lot of times, where basically anybody in the organization can look. So if here I've got a salesperson, and the salesperson can gain by looking at future product plans, they
Mhm.
probably shouldn't be able to access R&D team, mergers and acquisition, exec team content around the future product plans. But the sales team does need sales information to get their job done. So then achieving what's called just enough access and making sure that everything is locked down to the right roles and the right people that should be able to access that content. Again, that's not a Copilot specific thing. That's just good data hygiene and making sure that, the right
Yeah.
permissions and controls are in
Yeah, you're
place.
not showing Copilot here. You're just doing a Microsoft 365 search and finding things you shouldn't have access to, right?
Right,
This is
right.
stuff we should be doing anyway.
And
Yep.
it's the same search. Basically, again, it's the Copilot search is being run under the context of that user who's logged in and prompting within those Copilot user experiences. But the search rights and the permissions to files and documents are specific to that user interacting with
Mhm.
Copilot in that specific app, or in Teams, or in the any of those experiences. So I guess from an
Yeah.
admin perspective, again, these are things that if I wanted to go into SharePoint and search for stuff, or through other Microsoft 365, web properties, for example, and do a search, these are things I'd be able to find with or without Copilot. So you want to make sure that, in this case, just getting the right access controls and permissions around all your files and documents and all of those document libraries, all the different containers. And there's also a condition it didn't even dawn on me till I was talking to our own internal IT, but there's also something called undersharing, where maybe it's somewhat tribal in terms of where certain documents are stored for, like your health plans and things we just saw with Pablo's demo.
Yeah.
Where it's undershared now, and you want to make that more accessible to the large language model. And that could be either moving that information sometimes from a third party domain into SharePoint and having that be the source of truth where that document or those documents are being stored, or create a plugin to where it can access that external information. Because it's the way that we've got a lot of like healthcare coverage information and things at Microsoft that are outside of the Microsoft.com domain. So
Mhm.
it's not always easy to navigate between those two different domains and systems and where those different files are stored. And these are things, again, that you can solve for in terms of solving for both oversharing and getting just enough access if there's too much sharing happening, and then undersharing, making
Mhm.
sure that the model can find, or the orchestration layer and Copilot can find the information it needs to respond.
Yeah. So for my notes, I'm thinking, for oversharing, there's things like auditing your admin roles and who has
Hmm.
access to what, and do you have too many SharePoint admins? Do you have, heaven forbid, too many global admins? That's one thing that you can work
Yep.
through. Instituting things like DLP and sensitivity labels, like you said, it's kind of a double-edged
Right.
sword. Like I've heard some people in the industry saying things like, oh, well, I want to make sure that that Copilot never surfaces a confidential document or something like that. And I think that that's maybe a little bit too generic of a statement. I think maybe what's a better question or a better thing is, I
Yeah.
want to make sure that Copilot only surfaces a confidential document to the people that it should be able to surface that
Right.
to. And we get there with like sensitivity labels and information protection and stuff like that. So it's like, if your house is in order, then you worry less about, oh, are they going to accidentally stumble into something, or are we going to have a delve moment where somebody sees something that they should have seen because it was people centric or something like that. So
Yeah. And in a former life, I used to work on like massive kind of almost government type of telco registrations and contracts and agreements and things when I was working in Germany. And
Yeah.
the people that a lot of times can benefit more than anyone else is like, you think of the attorney who's got to parse through a 2,000 page contract and agreement and summarize some of the concept. Like those types of things, even though that's a confidential document, again, if you lock the document down to just the people who should see it, a lot of times those scenarios are some of the most valuable scenarios to where you're going to
Mm-hmm.
use the power of a large language model and generative AI, because some of this, and I wanted to go into the law profession actually before I started college, and realized that there was
Oh, really?
a lot of documentation that you had to read, and it was pretty involved, and I decided
You
not
could have
to.
been that guy using ChatGPT for legal precedent and been all
But
over the
I
news.
can kind of empathize with that scenario, because that's not the most like
Yeah.
compelling to read information that you can read
Yeah.
as a human typically, and there's a lot of nuance in some of the verbiage there. So having something that can parse that and infer what's in there and summarize those concepts out, like, again, these are massive things that if you think about it from just e-discovery and trainable
Mm-hmm.
classification that we have through a lot of the other solutions that we have that use AI as well. Like, these are
Mm-hmm.
massive areas for AI to provide value. So you don't want to necessarily say, like, if anything has a confidential label, block it from the system. It's more like, make sure that if Jeremy is searching for something, that document is the thing that only Jeremy should have access to, and that it's not being shared in a bad way to where it's overshared with others that shouldn't have access. So
Yeah. Daryl has a good point. Again, thank you, Daryl, for all the stuff you're throwing in here. But the reporting in SharePoint for how many people are sharing to everybody in my organization or anyone in the world, and can we, put controls around that, or can we expire links that are anonymous links where everybody in the world, that's built into SharePoint today that we can look at while we're preparing for Copilot. And what you have on your screen now about active sites, that puts in my mind
yeah,
another thing admins can think about to prepare is group lifecycle management, and not only having files that are too old from like a liability standpoint, but also if you have all these orphaned groups out there with data that's years and years old, it also might reduce the functionality or the relevance of what you get out of Copilot.
right.
So having fresh, accurate data by cleaning up your groups on an appropriate time is
Yep.
another thing that you could do to kind of prepare for these things and say, hey, do we really need more Microsoft Teams than humans that are working at this organization? Maybe we should clean house a little bit. Um,
Well,
those are
part
all
of
kind of
that
things to
too, in
think
terms
about.
of the recency and those things, you can include that as part of your prompt. So, include
Okay.
information from files.
Only things
So,
in the past 6 months
yeah,
or whatever.
past 6 months
Okay.
or past 12 months. So that a lot of that too is around, and I think this will be like the next kind of
Yeah.
frontier in terms of user training and adoption, is like, how are we successful with prompts in the best possible way? Like, adding those instructions, like we saw with FuseShot, where you say, I want
Mm-hmm.
to have it in tabular form or bulleted, and make the bullets all 12 words or less, and give me this type of information that's only 6 month or less old, and all of those kind of parameters that you put in.
Mm-hmm.
And then getting to a state where you're just very comfortable at speaking that language of basically asking what you want in the right way. It doesn't have to be like query language like you would do in SQL or T-SQL or something, but the natural language means of putting that information into the prompt, and then it can basically, the LLM will be able to infer what, based on what you're telling it to do, because it's got that natural language
Mm-hmm.
ability, and then spit back the response that you're looking for with the different parameters that you added. And those, I think those parameters is like, that's going to be the
Yeah.
next area of where especially where you guys, especially as MVPs, can help in terms of spreading that message of what's working, what's giving you the best results in terms of prompting, and how that's working out. And we'll do the
Mm-hmm.
same on the Microsoft side, obviously, but all of that as people get more and more kind of into it. You see it on some of the other models now in terms of people using it for image generation, etc. The prompting is pretty
Yeah.
key in terms of speaking that language and
Yeah.
describing what you want adequately. And it's arguably a similar thing. If you ask a person to do something for you, the more detailed and the better instructions you can give, the better results you're going to get back. And that's kind of the same way working with working with a large
Mm-hmm.
language model.
Yeah, Andy, you're way ahead of me on that with your upskilling into prompt engineering and being in depth about this. I think that's something all of us can take as IT professionals away is learning and getting good at this, because in a lot of ways we're going to be blazing the trail ahead of others to say, okay, what are the best tips and tricks, and how do you, get the most out of it? Because from my perspective, it's almost like I've had to relearn how to use a computer again, because I've been thinking for 20 years how to talk to a computer in terms of search engine optimization and and semantic search and stuff like that, and I have to like break out of that mold to kind of give it more information of what I'm looking for, rather than, well, I'm going to throw something into Google and then the hunt begins.
Yeah, and that's where this concept too, like just building an internal community, a center of excellence, and I know Caruana is working on this a lot in terms of bringing a lot of the knowledge that she gleaned in her team
Yeah.
from like getting teams out there and having teams get used in very powerful ways. Like this is the same type of thing that that you can do from a like sharing your successes and things that work as you work with prompts, and then that's the internal side of it. And then there will also be a lot of, I think, information sharing, YouTube videos, of course, and blogs and things that are working for people in terms of how to share their prompt experience as well. So just to go back to the
Yeah.
conversation in terms of tooling that you would use in terms of getting to just enough access.
Okay.
So the nice thing with the SharePoint Admin Center, it's a way to be able to go in and kind of audit who has access to information and see the different site members, your visitorship settings, the privacy set to the site,
Yeah.
whether or not external sharing is enabled for certain sites, and or teams, document libraries, etc., the labels that are applied to them, like all of these kind of things you can do. It is a process to kind of work through that list, but there are other tools that can help in terms of automating some of those steps out. So with Microsoft Purview, the nice thing is not only do you have, like, imagine you're doing a project-based assignment, and we've all done IT and project-based stuff where we might think, okay, we've declared victory 6 months in, now that we've done all of our work in terms of looking at every single site and document library, triaged everything. Then you still kind of want to have the different nets, safety nets underneath that will do things like automatically label and apply protection to files. And that's where things like Microsoft Purview can help in terms of document classifiers, trainable classifiers. So like if we do see that contract or that patent application, bank statement, etc., that it will detect that type of document that you can then apply additional training to make sure it's even more accurate than our built-in models, which are pretty darn accurate as they are. Then that can apply the right label, and based on the label that's applied, it will apply the right DLP policy or the right sharing permissions to that file. And then you've got a second safety net detected container of the document library for your legal team is not used, and somebody stores that contract off board. These kind of things will help in terms of being able to find, label, based on label, then apply the right policies to it, and then apply the right controls on top of it. And the nice thing with DLP in general is it's multimodal in the sense that it will work across email, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and Teams chats even. Your endpoint DLP that you can do on Windows and other platform devices. And then Defender for cloud apps, you can even wire in on-premises file shares. And I actually did this at home when we were building the show out for DLP. It all works. Like it's pretty amazing when you get all these different repos wired into your data loss prevention kind of fabric of what's being protected. And so these things will help, and again, in terms of making sure that people have the right access to information.
Yeah.
And then there's one other thing that I'll mention. I know Sesha Manny, we've worked with a long time, and Mark Cashman I see in the chat knows him well. But something else that's brand new is the SharePoint Advanced Management and part of Syntex. And so that makes things even better in terms of identifying oversharing and being able to flag you. Like here we can see we've got our oversharing flag in email that our highly confidential site project Apollo is being shared externally. So it can flag you and kind of proactively tell you about it. You can then request site access reviews for the site owner so that they make sure the right people have access to the site. And then you can restrict it to security groups right from this one experience using the SharePoint Advanced Management. So that helps again in terms of correcting any oversharing situations and proactively getting notified as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So getting to the admin setup guy, I think we've kind of delved into it a little bit as far as like pre-work and
Yep.
like almost setting the baseline, the foundational stuff. Like even if you don't go into Copilot, these are good activities. Like Daryl said again, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
But delving into actually implementing Copilot, do you have like the prerequisites that are set up? Like how
Mhm.
difficult is it going to be to actually turn on Copilot whenever it arrives in our organization?
Yeah, so there are prereqs in terms of at the high level one licenses that are in place for users that you are going to scope in for Copilot licenses. So
Okay.
Microsoft 365 E3 and E5 are currently the ones in scope for that.
Okay.
And then we have something called the setup guide that kind of walks you through the prerequisites, because beyond that, you're going to want the right endpoints in. Like if you're using say a Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise kind of perpetual licensed version from 2016 or something, you want to make sure that you're on a current or new channel effectively
Yeah.
of your Office 365 and Microsoft 365 apps. And then a lot of the experiences obviously you can get to from the web, and like if you're
Mm-hmm.
doing hybrid exchange, those types of things, you want to make sure the mailboxes of the people that you scope in are the online mailboxes so that they can use
Yeah.
that, and they have the new mail client so they can use those abilities. So there's a little bit of prereq in terms of making sure A, the right licenses and services are in place, and B, your endpoints and apps are the right ones. But it
Yeah.
is a cross app, cross platform thing. So we have experiences that will work on Windows, Mac, Android, iOS. Like
Hmm.
we've shown all of these things since March, and the web experiences are kind of any platform because they're from web. But it gives you more flexibility in terms of once you have those prereqs in. And then the setup guide is something that we've built for the admin center. And when you
Okay. So there's already a checklist
and this is
here
basically a
or coming.
checklist type tool. So
Okay.
this walks you through what you need. So Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, Microsoft Entra, making sure that you're using Entra ID, because there are
Mm-hmm.
third-party IDPs that you might use that won't necessarily have the same type of fidelity. And because remember, we're doing search based on your information access, and a lot of that's governed by the graph, which Entra
Yeah.
ID is the kind of access and authorization source over. And then you've got Outlook and getting the new Outlook, getting Microsoft Teams, making sure that's a sufficient level client, and then Microsoft Loop, which there are some steps to get Loop running, as you know, and probably Daryl Webster on the call knows all too well. And then the semantic index for Copilot, that's something we will provision on the Microsoft side as part of
Yeah.
getting that ready. And then after that, it's basically around what you do in terms of getting licensing assigned to the right people.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can from here in the setup guide apply if you need to E3 and E5 Microsoft 365 licenses to people. But,
Yeah.
those are already in place, and you already kind of have standardized on, say, Microsoft 365 E3. At that point, you just need to assign the Copilot licenses. So what you do there is once you click in, you can assign the right groups those licenses from a group level. And when you do that, those, in that case, 9 individuals in the IT team that I selected there will have the right licenses in place. And then after that, there's an email that you can use as a template. And I've seen the feedback. You might want to do this through Teams, but you've got a template that you can send through, however, whatever
Mm-hmm.
modality you prefer, to go out to say, hey, we're deploying this, and you're part of the initially scoped group of people that will have access to it, because we just gave the licenses or assigned the licenses. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can communicate like what's the experience going to look like within the different apps and services. And this is something
Mm.
that's always being updated, by the way, this email, so it looks a little bit different now. But these are
That's nice
basically
that you can have that built for you. It's also optional. That's nice from like
right.
certain organizations that are extremely large. Like maybe we want our service adoption team to handle those communications, but if depending on the culture of your organization, you could let it send the email. As the chat said, it's nice to see a setup wizard like this. I mean, this is as simple as what we saw with enabling Loop and going through to create like the Office config policy. It's just,
Mhm.
it's very user friendly. You know, it looks like I'm not gonna have to get into like PowerShell. You know, me
Yeah.
and Matt Wade are pretty PowerShell adverse. You
I
know, so
love
looks like
PowerShell.
it's
The
not
thing
going to
that
be
I'm getting
overly
used to now
complicated.
is the new PowerShell and the reworking of PowerShell. So I've got to get used to that now. I'm hoping to do a
Yeah,
PowerShell show so I personally can immerse myself into the
yeah, yeah,
newer ways of calling it via graph versus the older ways using the AAD
yeah.
module, for example. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of PowerShell, and I have been since it was new.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, yeah. This is nice though. The readiness checklist I think will be really helpful for
Mhm.
people
So
for, you know,
there's a really
not
good
stumbling.
question in the chat that kind of ties in with this, and
Yep.
I
Yeah, man.
wonder if we could just briefly touch base on it. Are there any considerations that we need to have with people that are licensed for Copilot working with somebody that is not licensed for Copilot? Anything that users need to look out for?
That's a good one.
Well, the Copilot controls will only be exposed to people who are licensed for it. So the people who aren't licensed, like in other words, as you generate content, it's going to be the license holder who's generating the content.
Hmm.
We're that was one of the questions that we had. Even we just did an AMA a few weeks ago in terms of like, is the content that's generated, does that belong to somebody? And no, it's your content that you generate at the end of the day.
Hmm.
So if
Yeah,
somebody who
you're
has a
doing this
license generates
individually.
a paragraph that is written into a document, yes, you can share that with your organization because your organization effectively owns that generated paragraph. Um,
Yeah.
so
This is a good
so
point that came to my mind is the only place I've seen where it would be like a collaborative Copilot experience is in places like Loop. I could think of
Loop is
Loop,
an anomaly
Whiteboard,
there. That's true. That's
yeah,
one
things like that.
where you can both see the I don't know the
Yeah.
answer to that one, like because the loop
Yeah.
stuff is still fresh enough to where that's the only experience I know of where two people can kind of see the prompting experience. um
Yeah. So maybe
and
the
theoretically both of
unlicensed
them would need to
is,
have a license for that, so I don't know
yeah.
what the controls look like if user A has license and user B
Yeah.
doesn't.
To take the
Yeah, I would
plane
be curious to
analogy,
see.
they're the passenger now if they're unlicensed, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe they're just watching in that Loop type of a
In theory,
workspace.
the one that doesn't have the license shouldn't be able to add to as the prompts keep getting generated against and refined. In
Yeah.
theory, the one that had the Copilot license would be the one that could type and submit prompt. But um, I
Yeah.
I haven't posed that question, but that's one to look into in that case because I think
That's
that's
a
the
good
only
one.
case where two people can kind of
Yeah.
jam together on a prompt basically.
That
And
sounds like a
Well,
good
I'm just
thing,
kind of
Andy,
curious from
when it
like
hits
the
preview.
document standpoint. Like, let's say we're co-authoring on a document. Like, we
Hmm.
both have the same document open at the same time, and I have Copilot and you don't. And so I'm using Copilot to like prompt against maybe a report that we
mhm.
did previous or other content. Boy, I would assume that the other user is just going to see the output of
They're
the
only
prompt.
going
They're
to
not
see
going to
it
see
once
like
you say add it to
the
my document.
placeholder there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Mm.
it generates the content for you, and then once you commit it basically to that file, that's when the other user would see it from the co-authoring standpoint.
Hmm. A mental note, Andy. I think whenever this hits like public preview and we inevitably do a show deep diving on Copilot hands on, that might be
Hmm.
something to test. Is like, can we have a Contoso user not licensed for it and see what their experience is in Loop?
Yeah.
We'll have to remember that for however
Yeah.
long
Just
down the
walk through
road.
the various apps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. There were some other questions that I saw, like one from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Marjolaine
Oh,
Hoekstra,
Maryland. Yeah,
Maryland. Okay, I didn't enunciate it properly. Um,
yeah.
yeah, from a privacy perspective on Bing Chat Enterprise, as mentioned, the things that you're bringing, and we've got a how it works kind of visual in terms of how that works. Um, any information you bring to the prompt for Bing Chat Enterprise is not used as part of training an LLM. It's not saved or shared. It's just part of the way that the service is designed so that all of the to and from traffic is encrypted. So if you think about a consumer
Hmm.
generative service, whether it's Bing Chat or it's ChatGPT, you're going to use it for consumer type workloads, the planning your parties or traveling to Greece or whatever. But rewriting the marketing plan, that's where things get a little bit sketchier if you're going to a unprotected type of service. That's why you need that extra security and that extra promise around where is my data going? Am I protected? So with the kind of commercial protections in place, in terms of Bing Chat Enterprise, when you do paste in that paragraph of information that might be from your business, your organization, it's not saved. There's no access to it from an eyes-on access perspective, and it's never going to be used to train the large language model, whereas those assurances aren't necessarily written in all the other modalities that you might use to build a prompt for other more public services. So this gives you, again, it's designed to have that peace of mind that you can build out that experience. Just to go a little bit deeper in terms of Microsoft 365 Copilot, this is where the orchestration layer in the middle is really, and this is, if you want to get to this file and kind of how, there's a really nice article on learn.microsoft.com, and I've created an AKA for it, aka.ms/M365 Copilot privsec. I think you can throw the lower third up on the screen, but it kind of walks through all of the steps in terms of what's happening from a processing and pre-processing perspective that the orchestration layer does within your trust boundary. So you ask the prompt, that gets sent to the Copilot orchestration service. The Copilot orchestration service says, okay, if assuming that the large language model is not able to answer that question or respond to that prompt, let's grab the information required from the Microsoft Graph. And the nice thing with Graph is it does use Microsoft Search. It's the get command in the Graph API. And it can find the information that it needs. It can find context around the user. If you say, show me X Fabricam contract, whatever, it knows that it's only going to need to search for people within a few degrees of separation from you, versus if Fabricam in Southeast Asia and you're in North America is working and they're both multinational orgs, it's not going to find the one that's completely separated from your normal work stream. So it has that context around your user account and who you work with and those types of things to isolate the right file. And that's part of the grounding process for pre-processing. Then the information that's retrieved is sent into a prompt. Like we saw before, the PDF was kind of mounted against the initial question. There is a system prompt that's appended to the top of it that says, be helpful, cite your sources, be polite, all of the things that you would want from a system prompt.
Yeah.
In terms of giving you useful information back, and not, and with the right tone and the right level of friendliness and usability, etc. Then once it returns that information, then the orchestration layer again does a bit of post-processing to make sure that it's still, relevant and all of those things are going to work for the user. At that point, once it's done the post-processing and the grounding on that end, then it's sent to the app, whether that's, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, or Teams, to either, respond to your prompt or to insert that content into the kind of the staged area for Copilot to commit to your file. But that's kind of the circle of life in terms of how all of this stuff works. And as I was mentioning, like the Azure OpenAI service and the work that we do with Pablo before, like that's all in the back end. And one thing that I hear a lot, and I see this in my YouTube comments too, people will assume that there's one GPT model that runs globally. Like there's only one. When I ask a question to GPT, regardless of version flavor of GPT, it's the one thing. And hey, aren't all the API calls being sent under the covers to that one model? Like it's just one all-knowing being that's out there. Like,
the Wizard of Oz.
The main thing is there are multiple instances of the GPT model running, and a lot of them, the ones that are running for Microsoft 365 Copilot are ones that are maintained by Microsoft running specifically for that service. There are literally lots of these models running concurrently together, and it's not just one. And like I said, it's completely separate from training. So inference is multiple models running concurrently with one, across different hardware and for different purposes. So these are instances that are intended for and used with, Microsoft 365 Copilot. And so, like, let's say, and then the actual OpenAI ChatGPT model is also running in Azure. That's not a kind of Microsoft managed quote unquote instance of that, or maintained instance. That's maintained by OpenAI. So the instances that we're maintaining as Microsoft are the ones that are being used for for inference on Azure OpenAI Service, on Power Platform, and Microsoft 365 Copilot. Our Microsoft cost management type solution, all of those kind of things are running on the Microsoft maintained instances of the LLMs that are used.
Okay. Michael had a good question in the chat here about the permissions. It's really helpful, by the way, to see this graphic, to see the steps that it takes and the number of turns that it does through the Copilot system. But do you know, are the permissions
The
checked
permissions are checked.
at what point?
They're pre, so it's all while you're going the first time to the graph. If you use you can go to the Graph API Explorer right now. I don't have the link to it, and I can't give you that lower third, unfortunately. But you can go to the Graph API Explorer right now, log in with your Microsoft 365 creds or Entra ID, and start asking it things like, "Who's my manager? What file did I last work on? What was my last email?" Maybe if Andy or John, you can find that link.
It.
But it's literally something like Graph API Explorer, aka.ms/Microsoft Graph API Explorer or something. But that's effectively the permission you have for initial search. So it's the search that you're doing through API Explorer and through the API effectively. That's just a GUI on top of the API is what's being found in pre. And so that it won't be able to even surface up additional information beyond what you have permissions to see. In the very first run, the first time you prompt it something, it's going through that initial level of permissions, and it can't pull in more information than you personally have access to whilst using Copilot.
Oh, that's a cool idea, though. You can kind of get into the Graph Explorer, start seeing what it has access to, and that'll hopefully give you a little bit of nuance into what you can expect whenever Copilot
it's the
runs.
Same like mentioned. If you can get to it from search now, if you can get to it from the Graph Explorer, it's the same thing. These are things and these are personalized to you. Like if let's say you and Andy were in the same org, and you were in the leadership team and Andy was in the sales team, you're going to have completely different results when you search for updates with Fabricam or whatever you're searching for, even though you're typing the exact same search string, just like I was showing before for the sales team person. The executives are able to find the featured product plans or whatever that need access to those, but the sales team in my example don't. It's going to be predicated based on your specific permissions, and then you won't even see the files. Like you didn't even know they existed, as the user doesn't have access to them because they're not being enumerated as part of the results, right? So that's the other part of it. So you don't even see the title of the documents, even if they exist, because it's all based on your permissions to those files.
Yeah.
And I love this. I love this because this is my whole thing. Like I like to reverse engineer and do the whole mechanics thing in general. But these are the kind of visuals that I will like consume in my free time. To actually explain the flow and process. And there's some more details to this that aren't on here in terms of how the the different search calls and various things, but at a very high level, like the permission, like I said, the permissions that you have as the person that's using Copilot, it's going to be predicated on your permissions. All the different results are going to have that. It's going to ground that information and the way that it responds to you, and check the information going into LLM and the information returning from LLM as part of processing. So all of these things there's nice checks and balances kind of at every level in that sense. And these are all things that, again, like if you want to use Bing Chat Enterprise, effectively you're manually grabbing information from the Microsoft Graph and pasting that into the prompt. Like that was the difference when we saw the e-bike thing. This automates and orchestrates all of that for you. So that's part of the value here. How it saves you time is that it will orchestrate all these things for you.
Yeah, it's cool to see this visual kind of maturing over time, and adding like those more critical details, probably in response to customers coming back. Daryl has a good question here of, are there steps that we need to set up that semantic index for Copilot? Like we saw in that step-by-step guide of like, here's the prerequisites. You need to be Entra ID. You need to have the 365 apps. You need to have cloud mailboxes. what about that semantic index? It looked like it was just kind of this is going to happen as you turn it on, but do you have more detail about how that index gets built and how long does it take for certain size organizations, any of that type of info?
I think, from a documentation of it, this is something that Microsoft builds. If you look at some of the documentation around like the connectors and adding semantic details inside of the connectors with like human readable and
Hmm.
understand kind of parameters, like some of those things I think will play into it. I don't have complete like a background or expertise in terms of what the semantic index, in terms of like curating that beyond, outside of what the Microsoft 365 and graph data streams are, the native ones to the M365 service.
Hmm.
That's an area that, I'll certainly get deeper on as we have more information on that. We'll have definitely content around, the semantic index, what it looks like in terms of interactions with connectors, plugins, those types of things. And there are some articles out now, and
Hmm.
I read through a lot of those. I've been reading through those as they're getting published. But I think there's more
Yeah.
to come in terms of how that works when you start using more plugins and more extensibility effectively for the model. That's an area I think
Hmm.
of opportunity in terms of adding more documentation around that once a lot more of these
Yeah.
plugins are used.
Michael has another good question here. So we see an acronym that's not defined, like RAI, that responsible AI check
That's
that you
responsible
mentioned.
AI. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Do
then
you
there's
have
RAG,
more?
which is Retrieval Augmented Generation. Yeah.
Too many acronyms now. Do you have more that you want to say about responsible AI and what Microsoft's doing as far as like making sure that our bias is exposed and dealt with? How do we handle those kinds of things?
Yeah, so there's a processing angle to that in terms of responsible AI and making sure that we
Hmm.
adhere to all the different compliance and security and privacy requirements that we need to in terms of just working internationally with our customer set. And then there's the part that's kind of like, as was mentioning on the system prompt, to make sure that the responses are helpful, that the tone is friendly, that information sources are cited, all
Hmm.
of these, that we're never going to recommend you doing anything that's going to be self-harm, and those kind, like all of those types of things
Yeah.
are part of just the rule set that are always part of a standard prompt, so that when it does respond to you, it's got all of these kind of rules in place to where you will get use out of that response, and it will be citing that sources, responding to you in a friendly and appropriate way. And
Hmm.
there are other nuances around, like some things might be regionally different from country A to country B, and what, like all of that stuff is all part of the science of getting those things right, in terms of like how it responds and responding in a way that's accurate based on the user and location and all of those things. So that's all just part of the science of building these services out and doing it in a way that is responsible based on the consumer of the service.
Hmm.
And a lot of it, like I said, is part of the pre and post processing, but a lot of it is based on the data processing itself in terms of being responsible, or the fact that we're not using
Hmm.
any of the content or your prompts or the answers or the responses to train the large language models. All of that's part of being responsible with AI. And there's a lot more that I'm presenting here in the last whatever minute or so, but in terms of our approach to responsible AI, but all of these things kind of contribute to it to give you the right types of usable responses that you will expect, that can be used
Yeah.
in a business context, that are helpful and not damaging in any way.
Yeah. And Michael, you asked about documentation. Sorry for the long link, but I did go find that for you.
Yeah.
I put it in the chat. So you can click it in the chat. Don't try to type it.
I think there is an aka.ms/responsible
Yeah,
AI or something.
probably.
I think I created that one. I create a lot of AKA links, by the way. I'm probably
Yeah.
one of the AKA link creation champions at the company. So yeah, there's a lot of I would say it's something like that, aka.ms/responsible AI or microsoft.com/responsible AI. But those are probably ways to get to the same information.
Yeah. Here we go. I just found it.
Did you find the
I
AKA?
will. I'll put that on the
RAI
screen. Yeah. Here.
standard. Okay, PDF. Okay, that's good. That works. And those
Responsible
are
AI.
things that we're continually adding to, and in turn we're not we're adding in terms of more detail and stuff to that as these things develop, because it's been such a rapid development cycle, as you can imagine, since December, and even before that, even November, and some of the times, frankly, that we want to make sure that we're capturing all of that information through the responsible AI and in the documentation that we have.
Yeah.
So we've seen the experience, and we've kind of talked through this. Talked about the prompting level and some of what goes on behind the scenes there. Can we talk a little bit about the infrastructure
And that's one of
on
my
the back
favorite
end of this?
topics.
Oh yeah, you want to talk supercomputers, right?
I
Hardware.
love hardware. Like as you might know, even if you follow my own personal, I'm like a total gadget and hardware person at the end of the day. So some of the coolest tech, I want to say, is in this space, and I got to say I'm loving all of the work that NVIDIA especially is doing in terms of their GPUs, the H and Hopper series and everything. So I'll just go through some of that. So from a hardware perspective, and if you want to see the real source of this, check out our show that we did with Mark Rusinovich. It's over 400,000 views on YouTube now in the last, since build, and build was what, the 18th or something of May. So it's really, really doing well in terms of how the service itself, both the public and our Microsoft instances, are run, and how the training works, and the hardware that runs it, and the metal that's used. But basically, we're using state-of-the-art and InfiniBand connected GPUs and NVLink connected GPUs to run these, because it takes a massive, massive amount of compute to do this well. And this is something that's basically exclusive to something that Azure can do, because the background in using InfiniBand networking, like that's pretty much from being unparalleled perspective in public cloud. As I talked and worked with Mark on building all this stuff out, this is something we've got a pretty unique level of skill in terms of running it. So the Azure data centers that run this massive, we're using like InfiniBand networking. It's all fat tree network based. So if you're a networking person, it's good. We have VMs that can wire in up to 8 different GPUs per VM, the N series, using the H100, the best of the best in terms of GPUs from NVIDIA. Then you've got all the Azure layer of manageability on top of it with Entra and the protections and ARM templates, Onyx runtime, deep speed to do hardware acceleration. All of these things basically that contribute to having the right platform to run both training and inferencing jobs at massive scale. One of the things that's really cool from the Microsoft kind of managing it perspective is we have, as you can imagine, like because of all the different stakeholders that are using, OpenAI and GPT LLMs, you think about it, you've got stakeholders in Bing, you've got the Microsoft 365 team, you've got Power Platform, and all of it, to be able to balance kind of who gets to use what when in terms of hardware. That's all, these are all very, and then the customers that are buying Azure OpenAI service, obviously, that need to be able to have capacity. These are all things that we have to engineer for and have a way to be able to do things like checkpointing of training runs, like I mentioned before. So for example, if you think about like the way an LLM gets trained, it could take days, weeks, months in some cases. And so what you want to be able to do is, if a training fails, then you want to be able to resume it where you don't lose any time. And that's kind of what we've built in the Project Forge. And then if, say, information or resources are capacity limits in one data center, that you can pause and migrate those jobs to other training centers, all of that are things that you can do as part of Project Forge. It sounds like my video is frozen, so I will change
Oh, yeah, you're fine.
1 second.
You're good. You need a supercomputer to run all these graphics that you brought for us.
I'm sending a lot of pixels over my Comcast network connection from home. So now I'm on the Sony A7 for anyone who cares. Okay. So I went from a ZVE10 if you're interested. So this is basically the way that we are able to manage at massive scale across these mega services. And mega service 2 is as OpenAI itself running ChatGPT and other services for its customers. So all of these things are part of the they have their own ways of managing GPU and utilization, by the way. But for the Microsoft services, we're using Project Forge, and this is something that we want to be able to, or that we're working on releasing for customer use as well. And so those are all part of just the metal and the platform that runs it. And then when you think about like from a training perspective and fine tuning, we've developed something called low ranking adaptive fine tuning. So for example, if you do need to fine tune a model, which we don't need to do in many cases because the prompts themselves are enough in terms of providing the additional information. But in the days of say GPT-3, we fine tuned for GitHub Copilot, and that's basically giving it additional ability to code. If you think about like and then the metal that's used to run the checkpoints that we're doing, like in the old days when you didn't have fine tuning, low ranking adaptive fine tuning, you might have to run an entire mega checkpoint in terms of running through that training exercise. Now, as you just target a portion of the LLM and just basically think of it like targeting your left brain versus your right brain or something, if you want to teach it art or something, you only have to use a much smaller set of GPUs in terms of getting that additive fine tuning in those cases. And your checkpoints are smaller because you're only touching fewer parts of the LLM in that case. And when we think about the hardware itself, and these are massive, 285,000 for GPT-3, 285,000 AMD InfiniBand connected GPU or CPUs, and
That's
then
crazy.
10,000 NVIDIA Tensor Core GPUs that were InfiniBand connected for GPT-3. We don't have the stats around GPT 3.5 or GPT-4, but the compute used to run this is massive, and there's physics around how far away the GPUs can be separated from each other in terms of the number of meters, and so all of that's designed into our data centers, and it's crazy how much technology is packed into what we're doing to provide these services across Microsoft, and also as OpenAI themselves consume the service. And so the other thing that I think is fun, because there's two different networking paradigms. There's the NVLink and NVSwitch. So NVLink 3.6 terabytes, capital B, per second in terms of how fast it can transfer bisectionally, and then you've got 400 gigabits per GPU and InfiniBand, which is already pretty fast. So you can get up to 3.2 terabits, not bytes, in terms of per VM. And this is when the GPUs might be like 10 meters apart from each other. So it's crazy fast, pretty much at all levels. And when you think about it versus like your normal NICs or speeds that you have on the on the RJ45 or kind of networking side, this makes those speeds look really, really slow when you're talking about InfiniBand GPU networking. And then on the board itself, when you've got the 8 GPUs connected on basically the motherboard, that's when it gets crazy fast. Like we had a stat in our show. If you imagine being able to copy 80 Blu-ray DVDs, 4K DVDs in 1 second, that's how fast the bisectional bandwidth is in terms of those GPUs interacting with each other locally on the same board.
Wow. So what you're saying, Jeremy, is like my little mini rack of Raspberry Pis, I'm not going to make my own Copilot and save the license cost, right?
Right. Right. I always like the comments of, will it run Crisis? This kind of things. Inevitably those will come up.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are supercomputers, logically designed supercomputers. They're not like necessarily in one rack, but these are things that are very, very smart individuals are architecting logically to work together. And you can look up like the InfiniBand stuff. It's all kind of I want to say it's all command line CLI based in terms of wiring up virtual machines to use InfiniBand, but I've looked into that, and when you look at the VMs that are the N series VMs, like they're expensive VMs to run. So like when you're talking about wiring up 285,000 cores and multiple VMs and 10,000 GPUs, like you can imagine the magnitude of what's being run here for training and for inference in terms of some of these models. Like it's non-trivial, I guess, in terms of the compute that's being used.
Wow. So if you guys want more detail on this, I'm going to throw this up on the screen again. This is in a video that Jeremy did in mechanics with Mark Rosinovich. And he actually Jeremy did a playlist of all of the mechanics episodes for AI topics and Copilot topics together. So it's this AI mechanics playlist. What else do you think we should be keeping track of to learn more about Copilot and stay up to date?
It's kind of like the different layers of altitude that you want to stay up to date. So I of course, I'm going to recommend mechanics stuff because it's something I'm deeply involved with. But yeah, if you do invest there's probably, I don't know, 90 minutes or so worth of those 14 videos, it says, that we've done since, I want to say since November. Power Platform was the first one in that series with Charles Lamona. But if you go through that, you'll learn a lot in terms of the Copilot, the endpoints, the way to deliver Copilots if you're building Power Apps, the way to use them inside of Loop, how they work across Power Platform. There's some really cool stuff in Power Platform with like site Q&As and various things that you can do now too. And then all of the stuff that we talked about on Copilot setup and how it works from the user and Retrieval Augmented Generation side, and how the Copilot orchestration works, like all of those things. And then the stuff that I showed with Pablo's content around ChatGPT and search, like all of these. I would encourage anyone who's like wanting to get deep on the topic to watch all of this stuff. Not just from a selfish reason, but I think it took a lot of hours, dozens of hours, hundreds of hours to get to where we could document this stuff. And hopefully it's all pretty accessible in terms of making it easy to understand. So that's our goal, at least. And then I would say, like, at a very high level, and we just saw the announcements this week, the Microsoft 365 blog for of things like the availability of when Copilots in, say, a more public preview, or when things like Bing Chat Enterprise and those things get announced. The Microsoft 365 blog is like the source for the top level announcements, the ones that are really important, that the very, very senior people are obviously authoring and have a large stake in. So those you can't ignore in terms of like making sure that you're checking those out. And and a lot of times the nice thing with these ones, because they're so important, is that press will cover them and post links to them, etc., as part of their stories. And there's PR behind PR teams that work with these blogs. So a lot of this stuff's kind of hard to ignore if you're following tech and you're on Twitter or Threads, or pick your social platform, and getting information, or just reading third-party kind of tech news sites. You will see a lot of what's here if it's important. And then at the kind of more drilled in levels, like we just launched this Microsoft 365 Copilot blog. You can see there's exactly one post to it now, but there, between in the tech community, there are a few, and then we just published one this week on the Bing Chat Enterprise FAQ, which is a good one I would read as well, and I will link to it. But that's another one, because there are a few admin steps to get that running that are part of the FAQ from Jared Anderson. And by the way, Jared Anderson is another person that worked in mainland China after I did, but yeah, that was one of our connections. And so this is another one, that the Microsoft tech community in general, Copilot blogs. And then the other things that are coming just from a message center perspective. So assuming that you're a Microsoft 365 admin, the important stuff, when things will be rolling out, getting ready for Microsoft 365 Copilot. This is an actual tenant that I have and an actual post that I filtered. So these types of posts will be in Message Center as well, the important ones. So hopefully between all these different channels, we can reach you and make sure that you've got access to the information that you need.
Awesome. Perfect. That's a lot of resources. Hopefully, if you're watching live, if you go back later.
I would say, like, just in general, you follow tech news. I listen to a lot of,
Mhm.
podcasts like Windows Weekly and those kind of things. And if it's at that level and it's from the Microsoft 365 blog, like those will get
Mhm.
covered somewhere, and then you'll know like where to go for deeper information. But mechanics, like we do what we can to be part of the first wave of announcements. It kind of depends. Sometimes we're looking for, is there a mechanicsy enough angle to the thing that we're announcing, like how much admin story is there, that kind of thing, before we do it. So sometimes we're not there the very first day, like March 16th, but as soon
Yeah.
as we start documenting like how retrieval augmented generation works and the different pieces of the orchestration, and then admin setup and all of those things, those will be things that we'll be delivering through mechanics. In the same way, when
Mhm.
we get policies, there'll be more policies that we're working on now that will light up, and as those policy controls get released, then we'll cover all of that on mechanics too. Like it's going to have more of
Yeah.
an implementer admin feel to it, of course, but
Mhm.
that's the area that I'm passionate about, and think I can at least help drive some of the traffic and discoverability. So that's where that's where a
Yeah.
lot of that content will find itself on my side. And then obviously anything that we do is going to be covered extensively in learn.microsoft.com as part of product documentation.
Mhm. So we're coming near the end of our time. I want
Mhm.
to take over the screen, as rude as that is. And I've been taking notes the whole time. And something we do, Jeremy, is we've started, Andy and I, we will do a collaborative loop workspace to kind of
Mhm.
live this life, right? So I like to land and give everybody who's watching kind of a takeaway. Like you can screenshot this and, somewhere to go as kind of a call to action. But what I'm feeling here is that some of the things we can do to prepare for Copilot and get ready is the prerequisites that we talked about, getting yourself like in the right state as far as E5 or E3 licensing, Azure AD, get your Office apps up to current channels so that you can, experience and use these whenever these Copilots as they launch. And whenever we get to the checklist, some of the things, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you want to add anything to this list, is,
Yeah.
step one that you're doing right now is learning some of this stuff.
Mhm.
And we can talk about, we talked a little bit about like just the basics of generative AI. There's some great LinkedIn learning classes that you can
Yep.
take about understanding generative AI. Jeremy talked a little bit about like the types of prompting: zero shot, one shot, few shot. I think it's important for us to embrace that, us as technology professionals are going to be leading the way in a lot of times in learning this stuff. So it would behoove you to start upskilling right now as like kind of your first step, confirming your prerequisites, getting your house in order with oversharing. So again, some of these things that we mentioned, just quick fire as far as like auditing how your sharing is, what your admins are doing, getting into information protection, lifecycle management. These are hopefully good things that you can take away to start working on. Bing Enterprise that we talked about near the beginning here, and some of the reasons why you want to look into Bing Enterprise. It's like it's already included in your Microsoft 365 licensing costs if you're E3 or E5. And it secures it so that those prompts that are happening in Bing that people are probably already using today in your organization, it makes sure that those aren't saved. Nobody has access to it. It's not used for advertising, things like that. So I think that's definitely a
Mhm.
no-brainer to look at. And then you
Just
showed
to
us,
add to that, though, the
yeah,
other
go
thing I
ahead.
would say, like, if you're using, say, an add-in, like I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking like a Chrome extension or an Edge extension, I try not to let people use things that you haven't checked or don't trust, because if you think about the
Yeah.
prompt, the LLM won't get trained in these cases because they're the person who's building these add-ins for Chrome extensions or Edge. They'll have no way to be part of the training process. So that's a non-starter in terms of like worrying about
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Problem is that prompt is going to somewhere and you don't know necessarily where that thing's going. So if you are using like a
Mm-hmm.
Chrome extension to say summarize my doc that's open on screen in my browser, just make sure that you're looking after browser extensions and that you trust them. If you're in a managed environment and you have control over
Mm-hmm.
those types of things, like test and authorize the ones that you trust. I guess that's the kind of a high level thing, and which should be true for all
Yeah.
extensions, but
Yeah. It's
especially in
something that we always harp
where
on,
nature
is
finds
that,
a way, quote unquote, to use an
yeah.
LLM. you kind of need to make sure that you have the right controls around those things. And that's the nice thing with Bing Chat Enterprise is that, we've got the right assurances in place that we're not doing anything, that's undesirable in that sense.
A quick question that just came in from Daryl. Do you know if Microsoft is planning on like extending Bing out to other browsers like Chrome or
I
other
don't have any
things?
information on that. I
Okay.
could
Yeah.
ask, but I don't currently know anything about that.
That's fair. Yeah. Cool. But no, that's a good
The
point.
Bing
Like that's
bar,
something
like
that I
the Bing bar on the side works. I mean, I've been using that with Bing Chat,
yeah, I
and so
love that. Yeah.
that's effectively similar. But yeah, I don't know what the extension story is, to be honest.
Okay. But no, I think that's a really good point is like I'm always an advocate of giving, enable your people with the right tools so that they don't have incentive to go use the wrong tools. And then you're just playing whack-a-mole, which
Yep.
if you keep up with AI in general, you cannot play whack-a-mole and just keep plugging all of the little places where, LLMs launch or plugins launch. It would be better use of your time, from my opinion, to set up the proper path for people to do the right thing. So, yeah. Cool. Yeah.
That's
And then that
good
final
list, though.
thing is assigning licenses, right? That's kind of the last step.
That's the easiest part, actually, to be honest. Like
Yeah.
in terms of just the IT admin style work. Once you've and like I said, getting your house in order in terms of Graph API search, those types of things, that's a best practice with or without Copilot. That you should be doing DLP, sensitive information labels, getting trainable classifiers per view deployed. It's optional to do like things like the higher end stuff with SharePoint Advanced Management and Syntax, but those are all good. Like you want layers of protection and information on that kind of content. So
Yeah,
all of those are very recommended.
for sure. So I want to put your information back up on screen as we're kind of a little bit over time, but again, another resource when we were talking about how do we stay up to date on stuff, make sure that you follow Jeremy on Twitter and his fantastic YouTube channel as well. He talks about, like, you were talking about your cameras a little bit when you switched over. If you're interested in cameras, which I know a lot of people that watch Andy and I are, Jeremy has a awesome channel where he tests out amazing new cameras space and just things that help you work better
Yeah.
at home remotely. So if you want to pitch your stuff,
I have a bit of a
we'd be
gadget
happy.
addiction. Like I've got a collection now of these things that I'm interested to try them out. I've got one coming that you can actually detach the microphone off of it and wear it as a lav mic, and that camera's wireless. It's like I'll see these things pop up in my feed, like
Yeah.
for Amazon. Like I gotta have. It's like an illness. But yeah, I'm naturally curious, I guess, and those are what I do in my spare time on the weekends. Just test this stuff out and try it. Hopefully it's helpful. But yeah, I've got my own channel on YouTube, and then I would say, like, in general, I don't do a lot of stuff in terms of I'm not a huge fan at the moment of Twitter
Yeah, I'm kind of on the decline.
and Facebook
Yeah.
myself, but yeah, it's we I would say from a mechanics perspective, we do regularly tweet and post on all the platforms, but I would say I'm more frequently on YouTube than any other platform, both for work and personal.
Awesome. Very cool.
So I think we sufficiently satisfied the requirements of a deep dive because we went really deep into this all the way down to the architecture. This has been super enlightening. We do have a bunch of aka.ms links that we're going to share. We'll put those in the description on the YouTube channel. If you follow me on Twitter, I've actually been live tweeting this throughout the entire session, including links. So there's the main video. I'll put that link in the chat window for anybody that wants it. But follow that. All the links are there as well. But we'll make sure we share out all the references and all the materials with this. I think that's going to bring us up to the end of this one. I know we'll look at a future episode of hands-on with Microsoft 365 Copilot, and around the holiday time, we like to geek out with tech. So maybe Jeremy can join us on an episode around the holidays and talk some more audio, video, and other hardware outside of the supercomputers that
Yeah, man.
that you get to work with every single day.
Would love to.
But I
And
do
I
want to
feel
say,
bad that my camera froze like two-thirds of the way through because that yeah. I feel like
but
there
you
needs to be
pivoted
some kind of
really, really well
redundancies
on that
there.
one. Yeah, you handled that one really well. The pivot went really well on that without having to undock and redock. But no,
Yeah.
this has been great, and I do want to thank you for taking the time not only to be here today, but the prep to and the resources you share with John and I leading up to this. This has been really eye-opening. I know we've got a whole lot to kind of debrief on over the next couple of weeks as we're starting to learn more about this and take that back to our organizations.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here. And with that, thank you everybody for joining in. That is 365 Deep Dive for July of 2023. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode at the end of August. We're working on that one now, so hopefully we'll have something to announce soon.
Yeah, man.
But with that, thanks everybody, and we'll see you again in the next one.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody.